To order two men onto the floor and then just shoot them execution style as they lay there helpless, like, you've got to be a scumbag to do something like that, right?
At 17, he already held a gun and ended 2 lives. How did he begin a notorious journey so early? 15 years later, the state of Texas reached a conclusion: execute him. The crime he had committed was brutal, senseless, and sudden, and when asked why he did it, the answer he gave was so cold, so devoid of remorse, it chilled the air around him. Would an appeal be the miracle this time? Gerald Lee Mitchell had only 24 hours remaining, each one measured not in minutes but in memories, regrets, and the slow, creeping weight of inevitability. What did he say? What thoughts raced through his mind as the hours slipped, knowing that soon there would be no tomorrow for him? You'll find out as we count down to his last breath. At precisely 6 o'clock on the crisp morning of October 22nd, 2001, Gerald Lee Mitchell awoke in the stark confines of his cold, windowless death row cell within the Polunsky unit. The bare concrete walls which had confined him for years pressed in around him with a new and unbearable finality. What had once felt like a prison now seemed more like a tomb, a silent chamber where life itself was quietly being extinguished. The thought of the years behind bars, more than a decade since the moment that irrevocably altered the course of his existence, settled heavily on his shoulders. This was the day that the state had decreed he would pay the ultimate price for his actions, a day long anticipated by the system. Beyond the thick steel bars and cold walls, the world outside was slowly coming to life. The distant hum of morning routines, the faint glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. Yet inside the cell, time itself seemed to falter, slowed by the gravity of the moment as the inevitable countdown toward his execution began in earnest. Born on December 27, 1967, Gerald Lee Mitchell grew up in Houston, Texas. Like many young men struggling through poverty, he dropped out of school in the 10th grade. Records suggest he became involved in drug dealing during his teenage years. Although no official gang affiliation was ever confirmed, drug sales in Houston during the mid-1980s were often controlled by local gangs. At just 17 years old, Gerald arranged to sell marijuana to Charles Marino and his brother-in-law, Kenneth Fleming. The meeting place was Lincoln City Park, located in the Acres Homes area of Houston. The two men arrived in Charles's Trans Am and picked up Gerald. He directed them to a dead-end street where he had hidden a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. Returning to the car with the weapon tucked inside his sweatpants, Gerald ordered both men to drive to a vacant house located at 8806 DePriest Street. There, he robbed them of $25, took the car keys, and forced them to sit on the floor. Without warning or hesitation, Gerald opened fire from about 10 feet away. Charles Marino died instantly. Kenneth Fleming, however, survived. Shot in the arm and hip, he played dead until Gerald fled the scene. Kenneth dragged himself to safety and contacted the police. The Houston Police Department swiftly launched an intense and relentless manhunt, mobilizing officers and resources across the sprawling city and beyond its limits in a desperate bid to capture Gerald Lee Mitchell. Authorities classified him as armed, dangerous, and unpredictable. For 7 grueling days, law enforcement pursued every lead, canvassing neighborhoods, interviewing witnesses, and following up on tips that often led to dead ends. The tension in the air was palpable, a city gripped by fear and urgency as the search stretched on. Then, at last, in the coastal city of Corpus Christi, the manhunt came to an end. Gerald was found, cornered, and arrested without resistance. Unaware that this arrest would mark the beginning of the final chapter of his life, he was swiftly transported back to Houston. By 7 o'clock in the morning, Gerald had been transferred to the Death Watch cell within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Huntsville unit. He sat alone in the small, confined space, the silence heavy as he awaited his final meal. Unlike many inmates who request elaborate or comforting dishes in their last hours, Gerald's choice was strikingly simple and unexpected. A handful of assorted Jolly Ranchers, their bright, sugary colors a vivid, almost surreal contrast against the sterile gray walls that enclosed him. When the standard prison-prepared breakfast was offered, he declined it outright, his appetite seemingly crushed beneath the unfortunate climax of the day unfolding before him. The candies, sweet and artificial, were perhaps the only small fragment of control he claimed amid a world rapidly closing in. On April 11, 1986, Gerald Lee Mitchell was formally sentenced to death for the murder of Charles Mourinho. This conviction marked the beginning of a grim chapter in his life. But the case did not end there. As investigators dug deeper into the events of that fateful day, a disturbing pattern emerged. Evidence soon surfaced linking Gerald to yet another violent act, committed within hours of the first, a second shooting that claimed the life of Hector Managgia. Reports revealed that Managgia had been fatally shot after refusing to surrender his necklace. Gerald Lee Mitchell's troubled history extended far beyond the two fatal shootings for which he was sentenced to death. He was connected to a string of violent incidents that stretched back several years. Among these was a 1985 armed robbery at a savings and loan. 2 years earlier, in 1983, he had attempted to rob a Baskin-Robbins, an incident notable not only for its audacity, but for the young age at which Gerald was already entangled in serious criminal behavior. Adding to this litany of offenses was a frightening altercation at school, where Gerald brandished a loaded revolver. Investigators noted that a chilling absence of any clear planning or consistent motive marked Gerald's crimes. The acts themselves appeared impulsive, lacking the cold precision or calculated strategy often seen in such cases. Prosecutors seized upon this chaotic pattern, painting Gerald's actions as the embodiment of a complete and utter disregard for human life. And Gerald himself? His name would linger long after the finality of his execution, etched into the annals of criminal history as a stark reminder of senseless brutality, a legacy as cold and unyielding as the crimes that sealed his fate. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Gerald received visits from his spiritual advisor and attorney. According to his last statement, Gerald's spiritual advisor was someone he referred to as Betty. Gerald mentioned that she guided him to the Lord. Betty's influence, gentle yet persistent, had become a steady thread in his unraveling life, offering a glimmer of hope and a path toward redemption, however frail. Throughout the day, chaplains continued to visit Gerald, entering his cell with quiet footsteps and soft voices, bringing prayers and words of solace meant to ease the burden pressing down on him. Gerald remained calm, unshaken, yet introspective. According to those present, he spent the time reflecting on his past and the pain he had caused. His mind flashed back to his trial. During the punishment phase, the state's chilling revelation made him more enemies. It revealed that just hours before Gerald shot Charles Mourinho, he had committed another murder. The proximity of the killings, both in time and brutality, left little doubt in the minds of jurors about the threat he posed. Gerald admitted to police that he approached Hector Managgia and demanded the necklace Managgia was wearing. When Managgia refused, Gerald fatally shot him. After the murder, Gerald went to a friend's house and went to sleep. The state also introduced evidence that Mitchell committed a burglary a few days after killing Mourinho and Managgia. Additional evidence for the punishment phase included an armed robbery of a savings and loan in January 1985. There was also testimony that Mitchell was often violent with other inmates and made threats while held in Harris County Jail before the trial. Other offenses included an attempted robbery of a Baskin-Robbins in 1983 and the theft of a purse in the same year. Witnesses also testified that Mitchell carried a .357 pistol to school and told a classmate he intended to shoot someone. Reports from school describe Mitchell as disruptive and violent. He threatened instructors and fellow students, frequently got into fights, and being placed in various alternative school settings due to his behavior, ultimately leading to his expulsion. Throughout most of his life, Gerald had moved to a rhythm of chaos and defiance, a dance that carried him through years of crime and consequence. Yet, in the silent confines of his death row cell, as the final moments closed in around him, the melody changed entirely. No longer the wild, unpredictable rhythm of his youth, Gerald now found himself singing a different song. He was consciously counting down to the time when he would breathe his last. At 9 o'clock that very morning, Gerald made a poignant request for writing materials. According to reports, he quietly took up pen and paper, composing a letter addressed not only to his own family, but also to the families of his victims. This final written gesture appeared to be an earnest, though somber, attempt to reach some measure of closure amid the overwhelming thought of his impending death. Over the years, Gerald had placed his hope in the legal appeals filed by his attorneys, clinging to the possibility of reprieve. Yet, with each rejection, his faith in the mercy of the justice system waned, leaving him to confront the harsh truth. Now facing the finality of the verdict and the certainty of his fate, Gerald seemed to be choosing acceptance, grappling with the reality of what was to come. He was indicted on June 8, 1985, for the capital offense of intentionally murdering Charles Angelo Marino while committing and attempting to commit robbery. His case was presented before a jury, which found him guilty of capital murder on April 7, 1986. Following a separate punishment hearing, the jury affirmatively answered two special issues under Texas law. Consequently, on April 11, 1986, the trial court sentenced Gerald to death. Gerald's conviction and sentence were automatically appealed to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. On January 27, 1993, the court affirmed both. He then filed a petition for a writ of certiorari, which the United States Supreme Court denied on October 4, 1993. He subsequently applied for a writ of habeas corpus in Texas State Court on September 19, 1994, followed by amended applications in January 1995 and March 1997. The court recommended denial of relief in February 1998. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied relief in September 1998. Gerald filed another application for habeas corpus in September 1998, which was dismissed as an abuse of the writ in December 1998. In federal court, Gerald filed a petition for habeas corpus in September 1999, which was denied in September 2000. Certificates of appealability were denied by both the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in March 2001 and the United States Supreme Court in April 2001. Finally, Gerald filed a subsequent state habeas corpus application in September 2001, which was denied by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in October 2001. These relentless and repeated denials of his appeals had systematically stripped away every last illusion Gerald might have clung to throughout the years. Each closed door, each rejected plea for clemency or reconsideration brought him closer to the inevitable. There was no mercy waiting in the shadows, only the cold certainty of what lay ahead. The weight of that certainty pressed down with crushing force, quenching Gerald's hopes one by one. By 11 o'clock in the morning, a crowd of local advocates had assembled outside the prison walls, their voices rising in a collective plea for mercy and justice. At the core of their argument was a deeply rooted belief that Gerald could not and should not be held fully accountable at the age of 33 for a violent crime committed when he was merely 17 years old. His legal team passionately emphasized that over the intervening years, Gerald had served various forms of his sentence, paying his debt to society in more ways than one, and perhaps most importantly, had transformed into a changed man. They argued that the boy who once made terrible choices was no longer the man he had become, and that this transformation deserved recognition, if not mercy. Testifying before the court, psychiatrist Dr. Priscilla Ray offered a key insight into Gerald's mental and emotional state. "You can't teach borderline intellectual functioning, but you can treat drug abuse," she explained. Her conclusion was this: Gerald's cognitive limitations, combined with sustained drug abuse, severely impaired his judgment and self-control. According to her, the signs had been there for years. By 14, Gerald was already involved in theft and cocaine use. At 15, he was arrested for carrying a weapon and smoking a marijuana cigarette laced with PCP. He admitted that on the streets, he felt an overwhelming pressure to act tough and prove himself. As the court dug further into Gerald's life, more details emerged. His mother, Viola Mitchell, testified that Gerald's drug use began during one of the most difficult periods in the family's life. She was undergoing cancer treatment and the household was financially unstable. These stresses took a heavy toll. Gerald's behavior in school deteriorated rapidly. Counselors described him as belligerent and emotionally volatile. His age, his intellectual limitations, and his drug dependency were acknowledged but ultimately disregarded by the jury. Even more troubling, the jury was not allowed to consider these mitigating factors during sentencing. On appeal, Gerald's attorneys continued to argue that his background and impaired cognitive capacity made him less culpable. Gerald was portrayed not as an unrepentant killer, hardened by years of violence, but rather as a broken teenager ensnared in the relentless cycle of addiction, poverty, and circumstance beyond his control. The plea for mercy extended far beyond local advocates. International voices soon joined the chorus. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch issued urgent appeals for clemency, highlighting a growing global consensus condemning the execution of individuals for crimes committed as juveniles. However, the state moved forward. In Texas, a juvenile as young as 17 could be sentenced to death so long as the individual was deemed a continuing threat to society. According to multiple testimonies, when sober, he was calm, respectful, and nonviolent. Yet none of that was enough to stop what was coming. For Gerald, the system offered no second chances, only a final sentence. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Gerald's lawyers filed a flurry of last-minute appeals. His legal team, along with mental health organizations and international human rights groups, made a desperate bid for clemency. Their central argument was the same. Gerald had been just 17 years old at the time of the crime. Advocates pointed to a growing international consensus against executing juvenile offenders. Michael Fianza, president of the National Mental Health Association, stated bluntly, "Execution should not be the consequence of juvenile crime, no matter how horrendous." Gerald's attorneys appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that his execution would violate international law. They emphasized that global human rights bodies had consistently condemned capital punishment for those under 18 at the time of their offense. But the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Texas law at the time permitted the execution of individuals who were at least 17 when the crime was committed, and the High Court had previously upheld the constitutionality of such sentences. Compared to other juvenile death penalty cases, Gerald's story remained largely overshadowed. partly due to the national focus on the recent terrorist attacks of September 2001. As David Atwood of the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty noted, it's sometimes difficult to focus your attention on these local issues. Despite the outcry from activists and international watchdogs, Gerald's fate was sealed. By early afternoon, all of Gerald's appeals had been denied. The courts had spoken, one by one, shutting the door on any remaining chance of reprieve. The Supreme Court refused to intervene, and no stay was granted at the state or federal level. His execution would move forward, marking another controversial chapter in the history of juvenile capital punishment in the United States. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, prison officials informed Gerald Lee Mitchell that the execution would move forward as planned. His legal team had exhausted all appeals. As part of standard procedure, final psychological and medical evaluations were performed to confirm his mental and physical fitness for execution. Gerald remained quiet and composed throughout, showing no visible fear. Observers also noted a heavy stillness about him. Before his trial, Gerald's IQ was measured at just 75, placing him in the borderline range of intellectual functioning. According to the American Association of Mental Retardation, one of the key benchmarks for identifying intellectual disability is an IQ below 75. A psychiatrist who evaluated Gerald concluded that his cognitive limitations would have significantly impaired his ability to process information, reason logically, and exercise sound judgment, especially under stress. Gerald's extensive drug use further compounded these impairments. Reports indicated that he regularly smoked a combination of marijuana, embalming fluid, and angel dust, an extremely toxic mix known to cause hallucinations, paranoia, and loss of self-control. The evaluating psychiatrist also raised the possibility that Gerald may have suffered from temporal lobe seizures, a serious neurological condition known to trigger confusion, erratic mood shifts, and even sudden violent outbursts. However, no follow-up medical testing was ever conducted to confirm this diagnosis. Under Texas law, jurors determining whether to impose a death sentence must consider whether the defendant is likely to commit future acts of violence, commonly referred to as future dangerousness. Despite long-standing concerns in the scientific and psychiatric communities that such predictions are unreliable, Texas courts have continued to permit this question to guide sentencing. In Gerald's case, the prosecution relied on his criminal history, jail behavior, and lack of remorse to support their claim that he posed a continuing threat to society. The defense did not present countervailing evidence to challenge the foundation or reliability of the future dangerousness standard itself. Additionally, the defense did not highlight how Gerald's age at the time of the offense might have influenced his behavior. This could be one reason Gerald wasn't optimistic about receiving a stay of execution. He had already given up. It was over, and there was no second chance. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Gerald took a short walk from his death watch cell to the execution chamber. It was here that Gerald would spend the last moments of his life. Every step brought him closer to the inevitable, and the final chapter was closing. While on death row, Gerald expressed deep remorse for the murders and the path his life had taken. "I was young, I didn't care about living," he reflected. "I was full of hate, full of rage. I really can't explain why. I was drawn to the wild side, the street life where you're trying to make a name for yourself." Yet at 33, Gerald believed he was no longer the same troubled teenager who had taken 2 lives. In a heartfelt letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, he wrote, "I have come so very long a way, since the year of that mentally disturbed and unsettled 17-year young person. I have truly matured." His email got no response. As Gerald was strapped to the gurney preparing for the final procedure, He gathered his thoughts and made a final statement. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on everyone present. Gerald apologized to the victim's mother with steady resolve. "Where's Mr. Marino's mother? Did you get my letter? Just wanted to let you know I sincerely meant everything I wrote. I am sorry for the pain. I am sorry for the life I took from you. I ask God for forgiveness, and I ask you for the same. I know it may be hard, but I'm sorry for what I did. To my family, I love each and every one of you. Be strong. Know my love is always with you, always. I know I am going home to be with the Lord. Shed tears of happiness for me. I love each and every one of you. Keep on living. Betty, you have been wonderful. You guided me to the Lord. You have been like a mother to me. Sean, Rusty, Jenny, Marcia. God bless each and every one of y'all. Jesus, I confess you as my Lord and Savior. I know when I die, I'll have life in heaven and life eternal, everlasting. I am ready for the mansion that you promised me. Take care. It's all right, Sean. It's all right. I'm going to a better place." Witnesses, including family members, the victim's mother, Diane Marino, clergy, and members of the press were seated behind glass partitions, separated from the execution chamber. The somber atmosphere was heavy with emotion as the lethal injection was administered to Gerald. At exactly 6:25 in the evening, Gerald Lee Mitchell was pronounced dead by lethal injection, and his body was brought down. Gerald's execution passed with remarkably little fanfare, slipping quietly under the radar of public awareness. There were no massive protests, no sweeping news specials, no clamoring headlines demanding justice or mercy. Only a brief Associated Press article succinctly marking the final act of a long and tragic saga. The conclusion of justice served for the lives shattered along the way. Despite the subdued coverage, this story holds profound significance, demanding that we look beyond the headlines to the human lives forever altered. Charles Marino was only 20 years old, a young man full of potential, perhaps a beloved son, a brother, a friend, who had innocently gone to meet a man for what should have been a simple transaction and never returned home. The void left by his absence stretched far beyond any news article, echoing in the grief of those who loved him. In Gerald's final moments, he offered an apology to Charles's mother, a gesture meant to acknowledge the pain caused. But in the quiet aftermath, one is left to wonder, was that apology enough? Could words ever truly bridge the vast chasm left by such loss? The story, in its somber silence, reminds us that justice is more than a verdict or an execution. It is the ongoing struggle to reconcile with the irreparable wounds inflicted on countless lives. On October 22, 2001, the state of Texas executed Gerald Lee Mitchell, a man convicted of the cold-blooded murder of Charles Angelo Marino. Despite the gravity of his crimes, the case has since largely